Jake Mitchell pushed open the doors to the Galactic Blood Repository for the 18th time in 18 months, and Nurse Thaler's crystalline body actually dimmed when she saw him. Not because she disliked him, exactly. But because she knew what was coming, and she was tired of delivering bad news to someone who refused to stop hoping. The repository was massive, spanning 3 floors of Station Kepler 442, with donation pods designed for everything from silicon-based lifeforms to methane breathers. Thaler had worked here for 42 years, and she'd seen blood samples from species that looked like liquid mercury, others that glowed in the dark, and one memorable gastropoid whose blood was technically classified as a sentient gas. In all those decades, she thought she'd seen everything. Then Jake started showing up. He was just so human. Average height, maybe a bit thick around the middle from too many years eating station food. His hands were rough and stained green from working with the hybrid crops in the agricultural sector. He wore the same faded work jacket every time, smelled faintly of soil and fertilizer, and always smiled at her like they were old friends, even though she'd rejected his donation 17 times straight. "Morning, Thaler," Jake said, rolling up his sleeve before she even asked. "Beautiful day on the station, isn't it?" There were no days on the station. They were in deep space. Thaler's translation implant struggled with human sarcasm sometimes. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, pulling up his file on her datapad. The thing was flagged so many times it looked like someone had attacked it with a red marker. "Your previous samples have all shown." I know, Jake interrupted, settling into the donation chair. It adjusted automatically, trying to figure out what species he was before recognizing the human biosignature. Too many white blood cells. Clotting factors all wrong. Antibodies doing weird things. My blood basically throws a party and nobody else is invited. Thaler's facial crystals flickered in what might have been amusement. Humans had a strange way of describing medical conditions. "Then why do you keep coming back?" she asked, not for the first time. Jake shrugged. "My buddy Carlos works maintenance on level 7. 3 months ago, he got exposed to some Andromedan virus when a coolant line burst. Nearly died. They couldn't find compatible blood for a transfusion fast enough, had to use synthetic substitutes. He survived, but barely." Jake's smile faded a bit. "I kept thinking, what if my blood could have helped? What if someone needs something and I didn't even try?" Thaler had heard thousands of reasons why people donated over the years. Civic duty, religious obligation, payment for crimes, even just boredom. But Jake's reason was purely, stubbornly human. What if someone needs it? "Your intentions are admirable," Thaler said, preparing the extraction needle. "But biology doesn't care about intentions. Your blood is simply incompatible with our storage and distribution systems." 18th time's the charm, Jake said cheerfully, watching the needle slide into his arm. He didn't even flinch. "Plus, I figure you guys keep learning more, right? Maybe something changed. Maybe your equipment got better. Maybe my blood got better." "Blood doesn't get better, Mr. Mitchell." "Yeah, well, about that." Jake's expression turned sheepish. "I should probably mention I was pretty sick a few weeks back. Picked up some kind of fungal thing in the hydroponic bays. One of those alien spores that hitched a ride on the seed shipment from Proxima Station." Thaler's hand froze mid-draw. "You were exposed to off-world pathogens." "Yeah, laid me out for almost 3 weeks. Worst fever I've had since I was a kid. Couldn't keep food down, kept seeing weird colors, the whole deal." Jake scratched his neck, embarrassed. "But I got better. Always do. My grandma used to say our family has the constitution of a deep space freighter. Built tough, runs forever, occasionally breaks down but always gets back up." Protocol dictated that Thaler should refuse the donation immediately. Recent illness, especially from alien pathogens, was an automatic disqualifier. But something made her pause. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that Jake had shown up 18 times and she was tired of saying no. Maybe it was the way his medical file showed 17 different rejection reasons, and she wondered if number 18 might finally teach him to stop. She finished drawing the blood, labeled it Sample 18, and loaded it into the analyzer. "This will take approximately 7 minutes, she said. "You can wait in the recovery area." "I'll wait here if that's okay," Jake said. "I like watching the machine work. All those lights and spinning parts. It's like a dance." Thaler almost argued, then decided it didn't matter. In 7 minutes, she'd have another rejection code to add to his file, and maybe, finally, Jake Mitchell would accept reality and stop wasting both their time. The analyzer hummed to life, breaking down the blood sample into its component parts, checking compatibility markers against the database of 847 approved species. Thaler had seen this process thousands of times. It was routine. Boring, even. Then the humming changed pitch. The machine's display flickered. One of the reagent chambers started bubbling more aggressively than normal. Thaler frowned, tapping the side of the analyzer. Station equipment was generally reliable, but sometimes the environmental controls caused minor calibration issues. The display showed, recalibrating. Then, recalibrating. Again, recalibrating. That's new, Jake observed, leaning forward in his chair. The bubbling intensified. The machine's AI core, which normally processed results in calm silence, started making distressed beeping sounds. Thaler pulled up the diagnostic screen and felt her crystalline structure go rigid with confusion. The sample was consuming the reagents. Not reacting with them in the normal way, but actively breaking them down, adapting to them, like it was learning what they were and developing responses in real time. Thaler? Jake's voice sounded concerned now. Is it supposed to do that? The machine spat out results that made absolutely no sense. White blood cell activity at levels that should indicate severe infection, except the cells were healthy and organized. Antibody diversity that shouldn't exist in a single organism. Protein structures that kept changing between scans, like they were evolving while she watched. Thaler ran the test again. Same impossible results. She ran it a third time, triple-checking the sample ID to make sure there hadn't been a mix-up. Sample 18. Jake Mitchell. Definitely human. She ran it a fourth time. The results were even more impossible than before. And that's when Nurse Thaler, who had worked in xenobiology for 42 years, who had seen blood samples from 847 different species, who prided herself on professional composure in all situations, screamed one word that echoed through the entire repository. Impossible. Within 20 minutes of Thaler's scream, sample 18 was locked in a level 4 containment unit, and Dr. Raymond Hayes was staring at it like it might explode. Which, given what the initial readings showed, wasn't entirely off the table. Hayes was a cephalopod, meaning he looked like someone had crossed an octopus with a really judgmental professor. 4 of his 8 limbs were currently holding different datapads, 2 were gesturing wildly at holographic displays, and the remaining 2 were rubbing his temples in what humans had learned was the alien equivalent of a stress headache. Run it again, he said to his assistant, a young intern named Troy who'd drawn the short straw for weekend duty. Troy, who was human himself and deeply uncomfortable with the idea that another human's blood was causing this much chaos, loaded a fresh analyzer with a microsample of Jake's blood. The machine lasted 4 to 5 seconds before displaying the same error messages that had broken 3 other analyzers that morning. Okay, so it's not the equipment, Troy muttered, making notes. The sample is genuinely doing something that our machines can't process. Hayes moved to the quantum microscope, his most expensive piece of equipment and the one thing on the station that could observe cellular activity at the molecular level in real time. He placed a single drop of sample 18 under the lens and adjusted the focus. Then 3 of his 8 limbs went completely rigid. Jake's white blood cells were moving across the slide like tiny soldiers on patrol. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was what happened when Hayes introduced a test pathogen, a harmless but recognizable bacterial strain used for training purposes. The white blood cells didn't just attack it. They surrounded it, analyzed it, and then something incredible happened. Hayes watched as the cells literally communicated with each other, passing chemical signals back and forth. Within minutes, they developed a coordinated response. Some cells built barriers to contain the bacteria. Others produced antibodies. A third group seemed to be cataloging the bacteria's structure, like they were taking notes for later. It's like watching a military briefing, Troy whispered, looking over Hayes' shoulder. They're learning. Hayes introduced a second pathogen, something more aggressive. The white blood cells responded even faster this time. They'd learned from the first encounter and applied those lessons immediately. By the third pathogen, the response was almost instantaneous. Get Mitchell down here, Hayes said quietly. And pull his complete medical history. I want to know every time he's been sick, every vaccination, every sneeze and cough since birth. Jake arrived an hour later, still wearing his work clothes and looking worried. Am I in trouble? Did my blood break something expensive? Sit, Hayes said, gesturing to a chair with 2 limbs while the others continued working. Tell me about your childhood. My childhood? Jake blinked. What's that got to do with anything? Humor me. So Jake talked. He'd grown up on Frontier Station Delta 9, one of those rough-and-tumble colony outposts where humans and a dozen other species all lived crammed together, sharing air recyclers and water systems that barely worked. His dad ran a trading post, his mom fixed ships, and Jake spent his childhood running around with alien kids, eating food from 6 different planets, and getting into trouble. I was sick a lot, Jake admitted. Nothing serious, just always catching whatever was going around. Mom used to joke that I collected diseases like other kids collected trading cards. But I always got better. Sometimes it took a while, but I always bounced back. Hayes pulled up Jake's medical records on a holographic display. They painted a picture that made his scientific mind race. Jake had been treated for Andromedan spotted fever at age 7. Rigelian flu at 9. Some kind of crystalline rash at 12. A respiratory infection from something called Proxima cough at 15. The list went on and on. How many different planets have you visited? Hayes asked. Jake counted on his fingers. 42, I think? Maybe 43 if you count that refueling stop at Kepler 22. Hayes pulled up the Concordance Medical Database, the most comprehensive collection of xenopathological data in known space. He started cross-referencing the diseases in Jake's medical history with known alien pathogens. The computer started beeping. Match found. Then another. And another. Troy leaned in to read the results, and his face went pale. Doc, that's not possible. Half of these diseases are supposed to be fatal to humans. They are fatal to most humans, Hayes corrected, his limbs moving frantically across datapads now. But clearly not to this human. He pulled up more data. Jake's blood contained antibodies for 31 different diseases. Not just antibodies, but active, adapting antibodies that seemed to be constantly updating themselves. Hayes recognized patterns from species all across the concordance. Rigelian wasting plague, which had killed billions. Crystalline dissolution syndrome. Neural rot. The methane bloom currently ravaging Titan. And 3 diseases that were supposed to be universally fatal. Pathogens so aggressive that they could jump between completely different biological systems, killing silicon-based and carbon-based life forms with equal efficiency. Mr. Mitchell, Hayes said slowly, have you ever been diagnosed with Red Death? Jake's face scrunched up in thought. Is that the one that makes you see double and gives you a wicked rash? Yeah, caught that when I was 19, working a cargo hauler route through the Gamma sector. Was sick for a month. Thought I was gonna die, honestly. You should have died, Hayes said flatly. Red Death has a 99.7% fatality rate. In humans, it's 100% fatal. Always. There are no recorded survivors. Well, I'm pretty sure I survived, Jake said, looking down at himself. Unless this is a really boring afterlife. Hayes pulled up more files, going deeper into medical databases that required security clearances. He found documentation of 3 other diseases Jake had supposedly survived. Diseases that didn't just kill their hosts. They killed everything. Medical textbooks used them as examples of perfect pathogens, the kind of thing that kept epidemiologists awake at night. How? Troy whispered. How is he alive? Hayes had a theory, but it was so wild that he almost didn't want to say it out loud. He ran more tests on sample 18, looking deeper at the cellular structure. What he found made him wish he'd chosen a simpler career, like quantum physics or time travel. Jake's immune system wasn't just fighting diseases. It was archiving them. Every pathogen he'd ever encountered had left a permanent imprint on his white blood cells. But not a static imprint. These were living templates, constantly updating, constantly adapting. His body had essentially turned itself into a biological database, storing not just the memory of diseases but active, evolving strategies for fighting them. And that fungal infection from the hydroponic bays? That seemed to have been the final trigger. Something about fighting that particular pathogen had pushed Jake's immune system past some invisible threshold. Now his blood wasn't just reacting to diseases. It was anticipating them. Adapting to them before they even fully manifested. Hayes looked at the human sitting in his lab, this ordinary 40-something farmer who grew space vegetables for a living, and realized he was looking at something unprecedented in medical science. Mr. Mitchell, Hayes said carefully, how would you feel about helping us save a few billion lives? Jake's eyebrows went up. A few billion? Give or take, Hayes confirmed. But we're going to need a lot more blood samples. And we're going to need to figure out how your body is doing what it's doing. Jake looked at the holographic displays showing his medical history, all those childhood illnesses, all those close calls that should have killed him. He thought about his friend Carlos, nearly dying from a virus because the blood bank couldn't help fast enough. "Where do I sign?" Jake asked. And that's how Jake Mitchell, agricultural technician and persistent blood donor, became the most important human in the galaxy. Dr. Hayes assembled his team in the largest research lab on station Kepler 442, and the first thing he told them was to forget everything they thought they knew about human immunology. The second thing he told them was that if anyone leaked what they were about to discover, he'd personally ensure they spent the rest of their career studying space mold on a mining asteroid. The team consisted of 12 of the best immunologists in Concordant space. There was Dr. Yuki Chen, a human specialist in cross-species antibody research. Commander Thrace, a Rigelian who'd spent 30 years trying to cure the wasting plague that had decimated his homeworld. A crystalline researcher named Vel who'd lost her entire family cluster to dissolution syndrome. Each of them had dedicated their lives to fighting diseases that seemed unbeatable. Now they were gathered around Sample 18, looking at Jake Mitchell's blood like it was some kind of miracle. "All right," Hayes began, pulling up holographic displays of Jake's cellular activity. "Here's what we know. Mr. Mitchell's immune system has somehow archived every pathogen he's ever encountered. Not just remembered them, but created living, adapting templates for fighting them. The question is, can we replicate this? And if we can," Yuki added, her eyes bright with possibility, "can we synthesize treatments from it?" They started carefully, with Jake's full consent and cooperation. 3 times a week, Jake would come to the lab, roll up his sleeve, and donate blood while chatting with whoever was on duty. He'd talk about the new hybrid tomatoes he was growing, or ask questions about their research, or tell stories about his grandmother who'd raised him after his parents died in a shuttle accident. "She was tough as nails," Jake said during one session, watching his blood flow into collection tubes. "Used to say that our family came from a long line of survivors. Her great-great-grandfather survived the first colony ship crashes. Her mother survived the Tau Ceti plague outbreak. She always said we were built to last, even when everything around us was falling apart." The researchers took his blood and began the painstaking process of analysis. They isolated individual white blood cells and exposed them to controlled pathogen samples in sealed containment units. What they saw was remarkable. When they introduced Rigelian wasting plague to Jake's blood cells, there was a moment of recognition, like the cells were checking an internal database. Then, within 40 minutes, the cells started producing antibodies. Not generic antibodies, but highly specific ones that targeted the exact weak points in the plague structure. Commander Thrace watched the process with all 4 of his eyes, his translator struggling to convey his emotion. "Impossible," he kept muttering. "We've been studying this plague for 300 years. 300 years. And his blood just figured it out in 40 minutes. But it wasn't perfect. The antibodies worked, but they needed refinement. The team spent weeks learning how to extract the immune response from Jake's cells and synthesize it into something stable enough to use as treatment. It was like learning a new language, one written in proteins and cellular signals instead of words. They tested it on lab samples of the wasting plague. The synthetic antibodies attacked the disease with brutal efficiency, breaking down its protein shell and neutralizing it completely. Thrace actually cried, which involved a complicated series of color changes across his skin that the humans found both beautiful and slightly alarming. "Test it on crystalline dissolution syndrome next," Vel said, her voice tight with controlled hope. The dissolution syndrome was different from the wasting plague. It attacked silicon-based life forms, breaking down their crystalline structures from the inside. It was slow, painful, and always fatal. Vel had watched it kill her family over the course of 5 years. Jake's blood responded differently to this pathogen. His cells took longer to analyze it, almost 3 hours, but when they finally produced antibodies, the results were stunning. The synthetic treatment didn't just stop the dissolution syndrome. It actually helped repair some of the damaged crystalline structures. "It's not perfect," Yuki cautioned, reviewing the data. "Maybe 60–70% effective. But that's 60 or 70% better than what we have now, which is nothing." They moved faster after that, testing Jake's blood against everything in their pathogen database. Neural rot, which turned cephalopod brains into mush. The methane bloom ravaging the Titan colonies. A fungal infection that had shut down 3 agricultural stations in the past year. Even the common Andromedan cold that spread through multi-species stations like wildfire. Jake's blood didn't work against everything. Some diseases were too different, too alien for his immune system to recognize. But it worked against more than it didn't. The success rate was high enough that Hayes started having trouble sleeping, his mind racing with possibilities. Word began to spread through classified medical channels. Other researchers heard whispers about breakthrough treatments coming out of Station Kepler 442. Representatives from the Concordance Medical Authority arrived unannounced, demanding to see the research. That's when things got complicated. Jake was pulled out of the agricultural sector completely and assigned a security detail. 4 armed guards followed him everywhere, which made his daily routine of checking on his tomato plants rather awkward. His small quarters were upgraded to a larger suite with reinforced doors. His friends started treating him differently, like he was something fragile and valuable instead of just Jake. "I don't like this," Jake told Hayes during one of their sessions. He was sitting in the donation chair, but his usual smile was missing. "I'm not special. I just got lucky with genetics or whatever. Why am I locked up like some kind of prisoner?" "Because you're not just lucky," Hayes said gently, using 2 limbs to prepare the blood draw while others typed notes. "You're unique. Your blood could save millions of lives. Billions, potentially. That makes you the most valuable human in known space, and there are organizations that would very much like to control that value." "What kind of organizations?" Hayes hesitated. "The kind that see medicine as profit rather than service. The kind that would patent your blood and charge whatever they wanted for treatments. The kind that might decide keeping you in a lab permanently is more efficient than letting you live your life." Jake went quiet at that, watching his blood fill another collection tube. "So what do? We find others like you," Hayes said. "We figure out what makes your immune system special and see if we can replicate it. We turn you from a single point of failure into a sustainable solution." The research expanded. Hayes pulled medical records from every human colony in Concordance space, looking for patterns similar to Jake's. They found them, scattered across frontier stations and colony worlds. Humans who'd been written off as having slightly weird blood work. People who got sick a lot but always recovered. Families with reputations for being tough survivors. Meanwhile, Jake continued his donations, but the physical toll was starting to show. His arms were covered in needle marks. He looked tired, moved slower, complained about feeling drained all the time. The team had to reduce his donation frequency, which slowed their research but kept Jake healthy. "We're asking too much of him," Yuki said during a team meeting. "His one person. We can't base the future of galactic medicine on bleeding one farmer 3 times a week." "Then we need to accelerate finding others," Vel said. "And we need to understand why frontier humans develop this capability while Earthborn humans don't." That question led them down a new path of research, one that would change everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in the galaxy. But it all started with Jake Mitchell, sitting in that donation chair, rolling up his sleeve for the 100th time, and asking the same question he always asked. "Can we help people with this?" The answer, they were beginning to realize, was bigger than any of them had imagined. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning station time, when Nurse Thaler was reviewing genetic data and drinking her 4th cup of whatever crystalline beings drank instead of coffee. She'd been staring at medical records for 16 hours straight, and her vision was starting to blur, but then she saw it. A pattern so obvious she couldn't believe they'd missed it. She called Dr. Hayes immediately, not caring that she was waking him up. "It's not a mutation," she said before he could even say hello. "It's exposure." Hayes arrived at the lab 20 minutes later, still wearing his sleep clothes, which for a cephalopod meant a temperature-regulating wrap that made him look like a very grumpy burrito. "Explain." Thaler pulled up holographic displays showing the medical records of 64 humans they'd identified with immune systems similar to Jake's. She arranged them geographically, and the pattern became crystal clear. "Look at where they are from," she said, gesturing at the map. "Frontier Station Delta 9. Colony World Proxima 7. Trading Post Kepler 186. Asteroid Mining Station Zeta Prime. What do all these places have in common?" "Multispecies populations," Hayes said slowly, his limbs moving as his mind started racing. "High exposure to alien pathogens in uncontrolled environments." "Exactly. Now look at this." Thaler pulled up records from Earth, from the well-established core worlds, from anywhere humans lived in controlled, clean environments. These humans have perfectly normal immune systems by human standards. Nothing special. Nothing remarkable. Hayes moved closer to the displays, his scientific mind putting the pieces together. The frontier humans aren't mutants. They're adapted. Their immune systems were trained, Thaler continued, excited now. "Think about it. Earth is a biological nightmare of a planet. Thousands of species, millions of pathogens, everything competing and evolving and jumping between hosts. Humans evolved in that chaos. Their immune systems didn't develop to just fight diseases. They developed to learn from them, to adapt to them, to turn every infection into a lesson. But that ability goes dormant in clean environments, Hayes finished, understanding flooding through him. Because there's nothing to learn from. Nothing to adapt to. They spent the rest of the night testing the theory, pulling more data, comparing immune responses between Earthborn humans and frontier colonists. The evidence was overwhelming. Humans raised in sterile environments had competent immune systems, sure, but they were defensive. They fought diseases when they appeared and tried to kill them. Frontier humans like Jake had aggressive, adaptive immune systems. They didn't just fight diseases. They studied them, archived them, and prepared for the next threat. It was like the difference between a soldier following orders and a general planning strategy. This changes everything, Hayes said as dawn cycle began on the station. We don't need to find more people like Jake. We need to create them. That's where things got ethically complicated. The proposal Hayes presented to the Concordance Medical Ethics Committee was simple in theory: controlled exposure therapy for volunteer humans. Take willing participants and carefully expose them to a series of alien pathogens in monitored, safe conditions. Let their immune systems do what evolution had designed them to do: learn and adapt. The committee's reaction was about what Hayes expected. Half of them were excited. The other half looked like he'd suggested setting people on fire to see if it made them fireproof. You want to deliberately infect healthy humans with dangerous diseases, one committee member said, her translator making her skepticism very clear. I want to train their immune systems the same way we train muscles, Hayes corrected. Controlled stress, careful monitoring, gradual progression. We're not talking about throwing them into the deep end. We're talking about teaching them to swim. The debates went on for weeks. Medical ethicists argued about consent and risk. Legal experts worried about liability. Politicians fretted about public perception. Meanwhile, the diseases they were trying to cure kept killing people at a rate of thousands per day across concordant space. Jake broke the deadlock in the most Jake way possible. He showed up at the committee hearing without an invitation, still wearing his work clothes, and asked if he could say something. The committee, surprised but curious, allowed it. I'm not a scientist, Jake started, standing in front of the most powerful medical minds in the galaxy. I grow tomatoes. Really good tomatoes, actually, but that's not the point. The point is, I didn't ask to have weird blood. I didn't do anything special. I just lived my life, got sick sometimes, got better, and moved on. He pulled up his sleeve, showing the needle marks from months of donations. You're all worried about deliberately exposing people to diseases. But that's what frontier life already does. My friend Carlos, the maintenance guy, has been exposed to a dozen different alien pathogens just doing his job. My co-worker Rita breathes in spores from our crops every single day. The docking crew catches whatever gets off those ships from across the galaxy. Jake looked around the room, making eye contact with as many committee members as he could. The difference is, they're getting exposed with no preparation, no monitoring, and no plan. What Dr. Hayes wants to do is the same thing, but safer. More controlled. With people who actually choose it and understand the risks. He paused, then added, I've got 200 people who want to volunteer. I didn't ask them to. Word got around about what we're doing here, and they came to me. Frontier colonists, spacers, cargo haulers, station workers. People who understand that life isn't risk-free and that sometimes you've got to take a chance to help others. One of the committee members, a Rigelian elder, spoke up. And if the process fails? If we expose these volunteers to pathogens and their immune systems don't adapt? If people die? Jake was quiet for a moment. Then they die trying to save others. That's more than most people get. My parents died when their shuttle's environmental system failed. Just bad luck, random accident, meaningless. If I'd died from one of the dozen diseases I caught as a kid, at least it would have been while living my life. And if someone dies volunteering for this program, it'll be because they chose to take a risk that might help billions of people they'll never meet. He shrugged. Seems like a better way to go than most. The committee voted 3 days later. The program was approved with strict oversight, limited initial scope, and enough safety protocols to fill a small library. But it was approved. Jake became the coordinator, which he found hilarious since his medical knowledge consisted of take medicine when sick and bandages stop bleeding. But he understood people, and he understood risk, and he understood why someone would volunteer for something like this. The first group of volunteers arrived at Station Kepler 442 2 months later. 200 humans from across concordant space, ranging from 20 years old to 65. They were farmers and mechanics, cargo haulers and station techs, people who'd spent their lives on the frontier and understood that progress always came with a price. Dr. Hayes designed the exposure protocol carefully. Start small, with weakened or dead pathogens that posed minimal risk. Let the immune systems learn to recognize and respond. Gradually increase complexity and challenge. Monitor every vital sign, every cellular response, every antibody production cycle. The first volunteer to undergo treatment was a woman named Riley, a 52-year-old cargo hauler who'd been exposed to alien diseases so many times she'd lost count. She sat in the same chair Jake used for donations, received her first controlled exposure, and waited. 3 weeks later, her blood showed the same adaptive responses they'd seen in Jake. Then another volunteer succeeded. And another. The success rate stabilized around 83%. Not perfect, but incredible. 83 out of every 100 volunteers developed enhanced immune capabilities, their bodies learning to fight and archive diseases the way evolution had always intended. The failures hurt. 17% didn't adapt, and while none died thanks to the safety protocols, they had to endure illness without gaining the benefits. But even they understood. This was science, and science meant some things worked and some things didn't. As the program expanded, the concordance began producing new treatments at a rate nobody had thought possible. Diseases that had plagued civilizations for centuries suddenly had effective cures. Medical stations that had been overwhelmed started reporting empty beds. And Jake Mitchell, who just wanted to donate blood to help his friend, found himself at the center of a revolution in galactic medicine. 5 years after Sample 18 broke 3 analyzers and made Nurse Thaler scream in her lab, Jake Mitchell stood in the observatory deck of what used to be the Galactic Blood Repository and was now called the Universal Immunity Institute. He was grayer now, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and he'd finally lost the battle with his waistline after years of eating too much station food. But he was smiling, watching ships arrive from dozens of worlds, each one carrying people who wouldn't have survived without the work that started in this place. The institute had grown to cover half the station. What used to be storage bays were now research labs. The old donation center had been expanded into a complex network of treatment facilities, training centers, and living quarters for the 4,000 human volunteers who now called this place home. They called themselves archive donors, which Jake thought sounded way more impressive than it actually was. "Still can't believe this is real sometimes," said a voice beside him. Troy, the intern who'd been there on that first crazy day, was now Dr. Troy Patterson, Assistant Director of Human Integration. He'd finished his doctorate studying Jake's immune system and had written papers that changed medical textbooks across the galaxy. "Me neither," Jake admitted. "I just wanted to help Carlos. Now look at this." A ship from the Rigelian homeworld was docking, carrying patients seeking treatment for diseases that used to be death sentences. Commander Thrace, who'd cried the first time they cured the wasting plague in a lab sample, now ran a treatment center on Rigel Prime. His species population had stabilized for the first time in 300 years. Children were being born who would never have to fear the plague that had haunted their ancestors. Another ship, this one from a crystalline colony, brought families seeking dissolution syndrome treatment. Nurse Thaler, now chief medical coordinator of the entire institute, had a 78% cure rate for the disease that had killed her family. She'd sent Jake a message last week that was just 3 words, "We did it." Jake had cried reading it, though he'd never admit that to anyone. "How many lives have we saved?" Troy asked, watching the ships. "Does anyone keep count?" "Dr. Hayes tried," Jake said. "Gave up around 50 million. Said the numbers got too big to mean anything anymore." Dr. Hayes had retired last year, returning to his homeworld to write his memoirs and teach at the university where he'd studied 4 decades ago. But before he left, he'd pulled Jake aside and told him something that Jake thought about almost every day. "You didn't just save lives," Hayes had said, all 8 limbs moving in that way that meant he was being deeply serious. "You changed how the galaxy thinks about humanity. That matters more than you know." And it was true. Humanity's reputation had shifted dramatically over 5 years. They'd always been seen as decent engineers, okay diplomats, and stubborn explorers who'd go anywhere no matter how dangerous. But they'd also been considered biologically fragile, medically unremarkable, and generally the kind of species that needed protecting. Not anymore. Now, medical stations across concordant space actively recruited human volunteers. Not as patients, but as partners. Universities offered scholarships to humans studying xenobiology and immunology. The phrase human immune had entered common language in 17 different alien languages, meaning adaptable, resilient, able to turn weakness into strength. The Concordance Council had granted Earth a permanent seat 2 years ago, citing humanity's unique and essential contribution to collective survival. It was the first time a species had earned a council seat through medicine rather than military might or economic power. Jake had watched the ceremony on a live feed, sitting in his quarters eating reheated pasta, and felt something he couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe. Or just relief that something good had come from all those childhood diseases that had made him miserable. The door to the observatory slid open, and a young woman walked in carrying a datapad. Her name was Casey, and she'd been part of the 3rd volunteer group. She'd grown up on a mining station in the asteroid belt, gotten sick with just about everything imaginable, and decided she wanted to turn that experience into something useful. Director Mitchell, we've got the latest numbers from the field programs, she said, handing him the datapad. Jake still wasn't used to being called director. It felt wrong, like wearing someone else's shoes. But the council had insisted, and Dr. Hayes had told him to stop being stubborn and accept that he was good at his job. The numbers on the datapad told stories that Jake had learned to read over 5 years. Treatment success rates were up across the board. The methane bloom that had been devastating Titan's colonies was now contained, with infection rates dropping to nearly zero. Neural rot had been downgraded from extinction-level threat to manageable chronic condition. Even the common Andromedan cold, which used to shut down multispecies stations for weeks, now had a simple, cheap treatment that anyone could access. There's something else, Casey said, looking excited. Remember that frontier colony on Kepler-62? The one that lost contact during the outbreak 3 months ago? Jake remembered. A new disease, something nobody had seen before, had hit the colony hard. They'd lost communication, and everyone assumed the worst. They made contact this morning, Casey continued. The disease burned itself out. The colonists fought it off naturally. Dr. Patterson checked their medical records. 60% of the colony are second-generation frontier humans. Their immune systems adapted to the new pathogen without any intervention. Jake felt something catch in his throat. That was the dream, wasn't it? Not just treating diseases after they appeared, but having immune systems strong enough to handle whatever the universe threw at them. That's what we're supposed to be, he said quietly. That's what humans evolved to do. Troy nodded. And now the rest of the galaxy knows it too. A young kid, maybe 8 years old, ran past them in the corridor outside the observatory. He was human, one of the families that had moved to the station when their parents joined the archive donor program. He had the kind of energy that only kids possessed, all bouncing enthusiasm and endless questions. 5 years ago, that kid might have been flagged for abnormal blood work if he'd grown up on a frontier station. Doctors would have worried, run extra tests, maybe recommended he stay in more controlled environments. Now doctors recognized what his immune system was doing. They called it activated human biology. They called it the future. The kid disappeared around a corner, probably heading to the education center or the rec room, living a normal life on a station that had become a symbol of hope for billions. Your grandmother would be proud, Troy said, because he'd heard Jake's stories enough times to know they mattered. Jake thought about that. His grandmother, who'd raised him in a cramped apartment on Delta 9, who'd scraped together credits to feed him and keep him in school, who'd told him their family was built to last. She'd died when Jake was 19, from a shuttle accident that no immune system could prevent. But she'd lived long enough to see him survive Red Death, the disease that should have killed him. She used to say we were here for a reason, Jake said. Used to drive me crazy because it seemed like such a meaningless thing to say. Everyone's here for a reason, right? But I think I get it now. We're not here to be the strongest or the smartest or the richest. We're here to adapt. To survive. To help others survive. Another ship docked, this one from a species Jake didn't recognize. The galaxy was big, and there were always new people to meet, new diseases to understand, new challenges to face. But now they had tools to face those challenges. They had knowledge. They had treatments. They had 4,000 humans whose bodies carried living libraries of how to fight back. Nurse Thaler appeared in the doorway, her crystalline body catching the light from the viewport. Mitchell, you're needed in Lab 7. New pathogen sample from the outer colonies. They want your opinion on the analysis protocol. My opinion? Jake laughed. I grow tomatoes, Thaler. I still barely understand half of what you people are talking about. You understand people, Thaler said, and there was warmth in her translated voice that hadn't been there 5 years ago when she'd been dreading his 18th visit. And you understand what it means to not give up. That matters more than you think. Jake followed her out of the observatory, leaving Troy and Casey to monitor the incoming ships. As he walked through corridors that used to be storage bays and were now filled with some of the most advanced medical equipment in known space, he passed photos on the walls. The original volunteer group. Commander Thrace holding a healthy Rigelian infant, the firstborn without fear of the wasting plague. Dr. Hayes and his entire research team. And there, near Lab 7, a photo of Sample 18 in its original container, the blood that had started everything. Underneath it, someone had added a plaque. Jake stopped to read it, though he'd seen it 100 times. Sample 18. Collected station date 847.3.12. Subject, Jake Mitchell, agricultural technician. Note, persistence pays off. He smiled and kept walking, ready to look at another pathogen, to help figure out another protocol, to do whatever small part he could in the ongoing work of keeping people alive. Because that's what humans did. They adapted. They learned. They survived. And then they helped everyone else do the same. 18 tries to donate blood. 17 rejections. One scream of impossible. And 5 years later, the impossible had become routine. The revolutionary had become standard practice. And the stubborn farmer who wouldn't take no for an answer had helped change the galaxy. Not bad for someone who just wanted to help a friend.